goal, prediction of outcomes, expectation based on actions, and social control. So for example, it can conceive of a future, not just a present, and project present actions into future consequences. This is one of the things that happens in terms of when there's developmental delays caused by drug use, particularly with alcohol, in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, where the structures to put on the brakes don't develop. This is also, as long as I'm on that theme, this is also one of the places that meth targets in particular. After a certain point, if you think of meth-like brain cancer, it destroys the brakes. And the brakes are in the prefrontal cortex. All right, so this executive function of the prefrontal cortex is basically what allows you to differentiate between these different options. So one could say, in terms of looking at personality, that this is where if you're going to use Freudian, not that I use Freudian, but in the Freudian conception, this is the superego that basically suppresses the impulses of the id and causes neurosis within the ego. Right? So, the ability to suppress urges that, if not suppressed, could lead to socially unacceptable outcomes. Many authors have indicated an integral link between a person's personality and the functions of the prefrontal cortex. This is a civilized person. Socialized, civilized person. So there are others that also associate higher human virtues and the ability to imagine future consequences, as well as transpersonal, that is, beyond the person, and personal optimal outcomes. There's a reference, the reference I got this from is Joseph Chilton Pearce's book, The Biology of Transcendence. The reason I have the graphic there, the Ethiopian angel, well, I'll go there. This is an Ethiopian angel. The idea is that in the I know you can't see that exactly, or it doesn't make sense, but here it is. Okay, you probably don't read Aramaic, but this phrase translates into love your enemies. But in Aramaic, it's instructions on actually how to do it. And so basically it's using limbic resonance. So in order to love your enemy, the type of love that is being talked about here, this word aheb, basically is a transpersonal force. So it's beyond the human being. So in order to actually use this force, since you have to kind of go beyond your personal ego, and what it's calling you to do is not love in the agape or erotic, which are both Greek words, which basically are both personal. Agape is brotherly love, eros is erotic love. Aheb is basically transpersonal. It brings opposites together in secret.
That agape was fatherly love.
It's brotherly, but brother is neutral for gender in the original Greek, so. To bring new life. So in the part that's instructions on how to do this, because Aramaic is a multi-level language, essentially you see into your enemy's heart. Replace what's missing in your own heart. So in order to do that, actually you have to see into your own heart first. And then see into your enemy's heart. And if you're doing this accurately, and if the limbic resonance is there, you can see what they're missing, which is what's causing them to be your enemy. So the love referred to here is basically it's self-love and self-knowledge. Because in order to do this, you actually have to have self-knowledge, and you also have to have empathy for your enemy. Now this doesn't have anything to do with turning the other cheek. Not at all. But if you can see what makes your enemy, you can also see what they're planning to do and avoid it. By also doing good self-care. So part of this, and the reason that this is a function of angel brain, because it's angel brain that is the seat of the ability to use what such abilities that normally we might call transpersonal or spiritual or whatever, but it's beyond your personal skin encapsulated ego. All right, so personal responsibility requires some personal self-awareness. So the ability to see your situation and reframe your situation for yourself. So for example, then in order to think outside the box, you have to see that there's a box. Now part of what we're doing, and what I was starting with, the little lame graphic that I had in the beginning, I was drawing on the board. When counselors speak, when we talk about reframing, like a picture frame or a point of view. So for example, let's start with adolescence. So this is from NIDA, I believe. The brain's front end, the part above the eyes, exists to slow us down or stop our impulsive behaviors. It considers the risks and benefits of our action and helps us hit the brakes when we consider doing things that are too risky. Now, the reason that I start here is that in America, many people start using when they're adolescents. Precisely when this part of the brain that would actually stop your brakes starts forming. So we have a risk-benefit ratio with using. So for example, you can say, yes, well, LSD is, if you're getting pure LSD, notice the if you're getting pure LSD, the main danger is sanity, because it's unlikely that you will actually eat a gram of pure LSD, which is 5,000 human doses, unless you know an acid manufacturer. It's unlikely that you will eat 100 sheets of paper acid all at once. So you're not even going to get close to an overdose situation. So the danger then is going crazy. So adolescents, oh, you just said LSD was safe. No reason that. Oh, well, If the risk is going crazy, then you just said there's no physical danger. Well, no, I didn't say that. The danger from overdose is low, but the danger from rewriting the software of your mind is high. So front of our brain is still developing connections to the rest of the brain until adulthood. So adolescents' brains lack some of the wiring, so to speak, that carries break or stop messages to the rest of the brain. So drugs of abuse are often available to adolescents. These drugs feel good, but they can be very harmful. So lacking some of the wiring for the stop messages, adolescents' brains may not fully weigh the risks of drug use because they haven't necessarily seen future consequences, and it's difficult for them to conceive of future consequences. So 2 drugs that cause the most deaths are also the most available drugs, like tobacco and alcohol. So late adolescence, before the brain is fully matured, is the peak time for developing dependence on those and other drugs. So for example, when we covered the concept of gateway drugs, this is why tobacco and alcohol, which actually do have the highest body count of all the substances people use, but usually, tobacco takes 20 years and alcohol will depend on the dosage. But people can die from that as well. So heavy drug use during times of critical brain development cause permanent changes the way brain works and responds to rewards and consequences. So it's important to go and address the substance abuse problem as early as possible. So that can often be taken into account when people, especially if they've survived into adulthood with periods of heavy use, they can basically acknowledge what the degree of toll that it's taken on them. Yeah.
So if meth is primarily affects that part of the brain.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we are prescribing pharmaceutical meth to kids with ADHD. I mean, have they done research on long-term effects in this area on kids with ADHD, or do they just figure, oh, their brakes are screwed anyways? I mean, what is the...
Are you actually asking if there is a scientifically based rationale for prescribing?
As well as, I guess, a little bitching, but yes.
I don't think the work has been done. It's possible that it's been done, but I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is the evidence is suggesting, I don't mind telling you that this is a major problem. And I don't think I'm being overreactive in saying that it's a major problem. Okay? So if the medical community, i.e. doctors, are oriented, if you don't have an addict label, they're going to treat you like a patient. And they're already oriented to basically, if you report certain symptoms, that there's a drug for that symptom. I need to concentrate, I need to study, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I cannot tell you how many medical, dental, and nursing students, because of the high demand, high study volume, are getting scripted with Adderall. They are. Is that a good thing? I think we'll see in about 20 years. Okay? But since it's scripted, the law doesn't recognize it as abuse. Now, that's not how I learned. But I see it in people that I know that are medical students, nursing students, dental students, et cetera, having to memorize high volumes of stuff. There's a whole issue about state-dependent learning. Okay? Are you going to be wired for the test too? Well, they are. So how are you going to deal with long-term sleep disturbances? Well, take more Adderall. Or what? So you're going to get into an Adderall Ambien cycle? Yes, you're under a doctor's care. What are the we haven't studied that. I'm making the assumption because of my bias based on what the neuroscience says, this ain't a good thing. It's not a good thing. But, we'll see what happens. I don't like that answer. But that's where we're at, policy-wise. But, it's a good question. It's essentially been going on, the medical clinic here, basically, we're going through that, they're going through that. The reason I say we is because we talked about it. Because we noticed this trend. Yeah, what are we supposed to do with this? That's not how we learned to become professionals. But there's this pressure to prescribe for social conditions. We don't like that. That's not correcting a medical problem. Are you asking a question in Cottage Grove? There ain't nobody there, right? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, we could actually well, it's just muting at our end anyway. Dr. Volko, who's the director of NIDA, current director of NIDA, wrote a piece several years ago. So basically one of the messages that we can give clients is that addiction can develop despite a person's best intentions and despite their strength of character. Repeated drug use disrupts complex but well-balanced systems in the human brain, and that, of course, includes pharmaceuticals. So many people are addicted to more than one substance, complicating their efforts to recover. And the human brain is extraordinarily complex and fine-tuned communications network containing billions of specialized cells that give origin to our thoughts, emotions, perceptions, and drives. So often, a drug is taken the first time by choice to feel pleasure or to relieve depression or stress, but this notion of choice is short-lived because repeated drug use disrupts well-balanced systems in the brain, even though we haven't defined what that balance is. We're just making the assumption that it's well-balanced, right? That persists, eventually replacing a person's normal needs and desires with a one-track mission to seek and use. At this point, normal desires and motives will have a hard time competing with the desire to take a drug, particularly since the drug experience from the point of view of the brain is kind of like dropping a safe, and once you stop dropping the safe, the brain is still looking for the safe to drop. So typically, when she's talking about how a person takes a drug of abuse, activating the same circuits as do behaviors linked to survival, such as eating, bonding, and sex. Drug causes a surge in levels of a brain chemical called dopamine. So dopamine is basically, in terms of tied in with brain reward, the nucleus accumbens, that part of the brain that basically says, okay, we need to repeat this survival behavior. The brain remembers and wants it repeated. So just as food is linked to survival, drugs began to take on the same significance for the addict. The need to obtain and take drugs becomes more important. And so the addict no longer seeks the drug for pleasure, but for relieving the distress of withdrawal. So they're not getting high anymore after a certain point. They're keeping from crashing. So eventually, the drive to seek and use is all that matters despite devastating consequences. So finally, control and choice, and everything that once held value in a person's life, such as family, job, and community, are lost to the disease of addiction. So when she's basically explaining, this is all on that NIDA side. So she's explaining for the civilian population, looking at long-term effects like reduced dopamine activity, depending on our brain's ability to release dopamine. So the technical term for this is anhedonia. That is without pleasure. So essentially what happens in this state where you have reduced dopamine activity as a result of drug use, then not only do you cease getting the same pleasure out of using, you have a decreased pleasure in living and natural rewards as a consequence. That's part of what has to, be recovered from as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that more common in drugs that directly affect dopamine? Like some drugs don't directly affect it, right?
Right.
Like crack.
Right. Well, crack does.
Crack does, right?
Yeah, because it's cocaine, and we know in terms of, when we've done fMRIs, or actually it's not fMRIs so much as radio-tagged cocaine. So the cocaine was tagged with an isotope. The person used, they watch where it went to the brain. So everywhere else in the nervous system, cocaine's a local anesthetic. Stops pain signal directly there. But in the brain, it goes to the nucleus accumbens, where dopamine is most critical. So then increased cocaine use basically most rapidly causes this reduced dopamine capability. See similar effects with amphetamine, so that's a different neural pathway.
But like heroin, that's what, endorphins, so would that have
Right.
the same?
Right, and remember, endorphins don't cut pain, they deal
Right.
with the emotional
Right.
response to pain. So you're dulling the emotional response too.
Oh, I was just going to ask about which drugs that mainly has to do with, like...
Anhedonia? Remember, your nervous system is designed to adapt. So if you're taking a drug that induces some amount of pleasure regularly, your natural capacity to feel pleasure is reduced in the presence of that drug, the continued presence of that drug. Some are more toxic and or more potent than others.
So it would be the same with process addictions.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say, for example, you could see this, I've seen this happening with people with marijuana. I mean, that's why it's such a subtle drug. I mean, right. You can OD on, if you ate a pound of marijuana, perhaps, or concentrates. But at the dosages that most people take, it's not dramatic enough, but the effect seems to be cumulative so that they're unable to get off without it. And so it becomes like you're constantly on it. So drugs produce very large and rapid dopamine surges, and the brain responds by reducing normal dopamine activity. This is across the board, but as I just said, certain drugs that kind of accelerate that because they're targeted to the dopamine pathway. So eventually, disrupted dopamine system renders the addict incapable of feeling any pleasure, even from the drugs they seek to feed their addiction. So altered brain regions. So we've been able to track physical changes in the brain. In fact, when we talk about organicity, now I'm throwing a lot of terms at you. Have I defined organicity here? Okay, so direct brain damage, physical brain damage to the organ itself. Organicity, not that it's organic. Organicity. So, disease can happen despite their best intentions or strength of character. Drug addiction is insidious because it affects the very brain areas that people need to think straight, so to speak, apply good judgment, and make good decisions for their lives, and no one no one intends to grow up being a drug addict, but it does happen.
And
Yes, go ahead.
well, I'm trying to figure out how to ask it. So is it like in a short term, a long term, medium term? How long does it take for the damage to your brain? And is it irreversible at all?
We used to think it was irreversible, but it depends. Basically, the whole concept of neuroplasticity is that the brain can rewire itself. But again, it depends on the substance, it depends on how toxic it is, it depends on whatever else you've done, and
So it's the dosage and the length.
dosage, toxicity, and what else they're doing. So for example, in my office, we were talking like a little over half an hour ago or an hour ago, we were talking about people were stressing about how to do the biopsychosocials, and I said, well, listen, look, this field for the first few years of it was dominated by alcoholics. Alcohol is one of the most toxic things you can do to a brain, and not all people, even though they might stop using, their brains have not recovered clearly years and years later. And I'm not necessarily being marijuana chauvinist about this. You can actually see it. They don't come all the way back. So biopsychosocial was designed to run with people who have those cognitive deficits from lifelong alcohol use. And so then there's the rest of us who use drugs other than alcohol. So depends on the patterns of use, what you mixed it with, other things that you did. For example, say you're a painter. You might not have used alcohol to excess, but the effect of being in an environment where you didn't seal your skin inhaled vapors is more toxic than the alcohol, and basically you act as if you're drunk. So there's actual neurological damage. People using meth, which the dominant process is the Nazi lead acetate method. I mean, there's still some lead when you're doing meth, so that's neurotoxic. Ms. Leatherman.
So like synaptic pruning and everything.
Yes.
When you're much younger, and they've done studies, where they feel like those passages can open up again or something like that.
Yeah.
If part of the brain was damaged by drug use, then is there any way that those passageways could open up again, or are those damaged as well?
You'd have to reroute.
Yeah.
You'd have to reroute.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's basically just like the damage that happens in traumatic brain injury, except it's chemical and more diffuse. Right? With traumatic brain injury, the brain literally got accelerated against the skull. There's physical damage. You have to, if you spend time in a coma, you have to, there's the physical hardware, and there's the software that means you have to learn how to walk again, to pee again, do all that stuff. The brain learns how to rewire itself around the damage. It can do that.
So I have a question, speaking of that
Yeah.
particular, Kathy Gifford, I think her name was, the senator.
Yes.
That was shot in the brain. And I know that she came back due to music.
Yes.
She could not speak, just speak. She
Right.
had to sing. Now she can
Right.
speak. So
Yes.
that's the process of all that being rewired. Is that what
Yes.
I'm understanding?
Correct. Okay. Music is one of the oldest, it affects one of the oldest areas in the brain. It's one of our earliest human skills. It's one of the things that make us human. I mean, there are other things, other creatures that do music, right? That use sound and stuff like that. But we, almost, you can hear a baby humming before they learn words. In response to that. That's why lullabies work with babies. Okay? There's a whole, my master's was on music and healing, the psychological aspect of it. So, right. It's Gabby Giffords. Kathy is the former wife of the sportscaster or whatever, but
Okay. Sorry.
it's all right. Yeah, Gabby Giffords, basically using music, because a part of what's happening with music, remember, we're mostly water. So the brain is mostly water. So water resonates sound really well. So there's going to be resonance with that. That helps. I hate to sound all woo-woo new age, but look, that we saw it with her. Definitely. So music can be used basically for that kind of healing. You can basically pattern around the damage, as long as you don't keep repeating the damage. Yeah.
So it seems like they have a lot of like concrete ways to help people recover, like walking or peeing or talking. Do those same strategies work with like the executive functioning, like the impulse control and the planning and organizing, or do they have tried and true methods of rewiring those things?
Yes. Will they do them is the question.
So how would that work?
Well, I mean, okay, so this is one of the things, where, I get in trouble, but I have no problem with getting in trouble on camera, right? So if we moved out of the 12-step treatment box and started incorporating diet, martial arts, music, meditation, chanting or singing, learning a musical instrument, writing, all that kind of stuff that we know in terms of neuroscience works. We've seen all these separate things, right? Things that, the thing, well, I have some respect and some familiarity with 12-step. It's like, okay, we don't do gospel choirs as part of, people, you leave that for your church experience, if at all. So 12-step meetings are rarely singing meetings. Okay, they're talking meetings. So what would happen if we shifted that and added, more arts stuff? Right? So,
They do have that, though. Celebrate Recovery does that.
Sure.
They do incorporate singing.
Yes, right. Because they're Christian and it's church. That's why. Right? Different framework.
I never thought about it like that.
But there's reasons why that stuff works. So that's what I'm saying in terms of looking at, okay, let's incorporate more of what works, and then we could basically stack the deck in terms of success.
So how would that work with paralyzation? Paralyzed.
Did I hear that correctly? Say that again?
I think I made my own word up. I said paralyzation, but I'm thinking where the brain sends chemicals down the spinal cord and sends what the body's supposed to be doing, and you're paralyzed.
When you're paralyzed.
Stops.
Yeah, right.
So how can that be opened back up?
With our current
If
science.
you rewire your brain.
Right.
Why can't you rewire?
Yeah. With our current science, no. That's science fiction at the moment. The connection's been physically broken. Yeah, when you're paralyzed. That's what you're talking about, yeah. Paralysis. Yep.
Paralyzation is what I said.
Yeah. It's paralysis.
It's just my own words.
Yeah, it's all right.
So would you think as, like, the reason they haven't incorporated the arts yet is because they feel that the clients won't participate, or?
Well, I have a friend that works at Passages, okay? So Akadama is a musician, really great drummer. So one of the things that he does, and Passages, you've seen their ads on television, they're overtly not 12-step. And they say, so some of the things that Aka does with his clients is he takes them on nature walks, which, the hills of Malibu, overlooking the ocean, watching the sunset. Hey, I'd go for that myself, right? So nature walks in terms of like doing awareness. I've done walks out here before we started developing, those back parking lots where you take clients out, and the exercise, you guys can do this at home, out in the wilderness or in a park or whatever. But you walk like a deer, and here's how a deer walks. You walk so the loudest sound that you make is your breathing. So you can hear your footsteps. And you get to a point where you can't hear your footsteps. So you walk so that your footsteps are silent. And the loudest sound you make is your breathing. So here's what happens when you do that. Your hearing extends. You can start to hear things that, wow, there's a millipede. What? I can hear the millipede crawling. Okay, now this is on nothing. Not hallucinating on it. This is just breath and simple awareness. And the reason I would call it walking like a deer, because I've stalked deer without trying to hunt them. And deer walk in that way. So they can hear, they're basically silent. So they can hear everything around them. And then they turn around and look at you and they go, which is deer for humans, split. Right? So doing nature walks, doing little awareness meditations, music and stuff like that. I mean, there are treatment centers that are doing that. But, Passages, it's Malibu, so, rock stars and people, it's spendy. But there's no reason that can't be used elsewhere.
So there's no limitation, like if you were to be a part of a program?
There is no theoretical limitation to do that. It's just a matter of will the program itself do it, incorporate that.
Administration buy-in.
Yeah, well, there's that too. Okay? Is it within their framework? And so when we're talking about, for example, the 5 modes of addiction. So in Indian country, yeah, we would do that. As Africans, yeah, we do that. The scientific community or nature, woo-woo, okay, we know, if we can explain it neurochemically, yeah, we can justify doing it. And there is some science for it. In a 12-step framework, 90 meetings, 90 days. Because remember, this came out of an urban context, right? Dr. Bob and Bill W. were urban folks. So meetings is where they're not necessarily going for walks in the park, even though Bill W., took acid and I had a spiritual experience and I could, go for a walk and all that kind of stuff. But that wouldn't necessarily lend itself to a treatment program unless you're like Hazelden or something and you have this sprawling hundreds of acre campus that people can go walking on in between their 12-step meetings. So there's nothing wrong with it. All this stuff that I'm talking about works, or else I wouldn't be talking about it, right? But it usually means, that the treatment center has to be willing to do that kind of stuff. There's no reason that they can't. There is science to back this up. There is. So, brain imaging. So just in terms of explaining what craving is. Thanks. Brain imaging research is revealing that signals or cues that may spark an addicted person's desire to take drugs can be incredibly subtle or quick, actually faster than you can consciously think. So expanded knowledge about craving helps scientists develop new medical treatments for addiction. So usually these medical treatments tend to be neurologic, not pharmaceutical, right? Because it's easier to give a drug that, an SSRI that basically enhances your serotonergic ability to block signal out. Rather, it's easier to do that than to teach you to block signal out without the drug.
So what are your, on cravings and stuff, what are your philosophies as far as, how you taught us?
Here's what a craving is. A craving is a persistent thought. Now, in Western psychology, they don't teach you that you can control your thoughts. Okay? So part of the skill to learn to control your thoughts is, you need to breathe in a certain pattern that reinforces a brain wave, that allows you to look at your thoughts and not necessarily develop an attachment to them. I really need a bag of red tamales, the candy, right now. No, you don't. I have the potential to become addicted to mango chili jelly bellies. I really want them. No, you don't. Okay? So, self-regulating. Okay? In order to deal with cravings, you have to be able to control thought. Western psychology doesn't teach you to control thought. You have to go outside of that to begin to develop that skill. Right? Cravings are simply persistent thoughts that you attach certain meaning and priority to. So we'll take this up more on Thursday.